Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the FIA Group.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Empowering Plans Podcast. I am your host for today, Brady, and not with me today is Ron Peck. Joining me today is Andrew Silverio. He is our Compliance and Oversight Counsel. Say hello, Andrew.
Hello, I'm Andrew. I'm not Ron. Brady's correct there. So, hi, everybody.
Perfect. You are not Ron. That is right. But for this topic, you are better than Ron because we're talking today about drugs in a way, vaccines at least. And Andrew's our go-to person on this topic and many others. Frankly, he's a veteran of PGC for people who know him. But he's here to talk about an important topic we wanted to give our listeners an update on. It has to do with the COVID-19 vaccine candidates. There's been a lot in the news about this lately. We've gotten tons of questions through PGC referral and frankly after our webinars with people asking us, what do we think is the most likely candidate? What will this vaccine potentially cost? How do health plans have to cover it? CARES Act and other laws that may apply. What other considerations are there for employers that are worried about their employees not taking the vaccine? Should they mandate it? All those questions are things that we want to tackle today on this podcast as much as we can. And without giving a 3-hour-long debate, which we could probably have, we'll just cover this thing from a high level. But I think we put together some pretty good information that'll be useful for everyone. So I guess a good place to start off with this is to update everyone on what do we have in terms of the candidates. What are the 3 most likely vaccines to be approved, and when should we expect them? Because as everyone knows, this entire year has been taken over by COVID-19, and everyone is waiting for vaccines to come out for us to get past this phase and sort of back to a sense of normalcy. And at the moment, it looks like we have 3 companies that have really broken through with effective vaccines. So they are Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca. And at the outset, it's important to note that the data on these vaccines is internal data. It's their own company data. So none of these have yet been approved by the FDA, but there's some promising results. So the Pfizer vaccine, 95% efficacy, that's really good. It requires 2 doses several weeks apart. And the government was really betting largest on Pfizer's vaccine. It bought 100 million doses, and it can buy up to 500 million more. So looks like that one worked out. And the Moderna vaccine is 94.5% effective. That's also very high. 2 doses there. A little bit more expensive than the Pfizer vaccine. We'll get to that a bit later on. And finally, the AstraZeneca vaccine, probably not the one that we'll see in the U.S. because the trials have been put on hold here. But this one is up to 90% effective, only 1 dose, and it's a lot cheaper. It's like $3 or $4 per dose. And that's probably the one that we'll see distributed internationally to poorer countries that have a harder time affording vaccines and storing them and things like that. So those are the 3 we're looking at. We think overall this has been a success. That the operation the Trump administration put in place to get this moving has moved pretty fast, right? Within a year, we have 3 candidates that are at least 90% effective, and that's important. But as I mentioned before, none of these candidates have been approved yet. There is a process called Emergency Use Authorization, which by now many of our listeners are probably familiar with. That's the next phase here. And so, Andrew, why don't you tell our audience a bit about what exactly the EUA is and sort of what we expect to happen in the next phase when these vaccines apply for this authorization?
So emergency use authorization is one of those things that most of us probably, never really had a reason to talk about before 2020. And now, the term comes up every day. It's suddenly just so relevant. So emergency use authorization, we can sort of think of it in a simplified way as FDA approval light, right? So it's faster. You go through the process of getting the emergency use authorization when you just need to roll something out and there isn't time to wait for the full FDA approval and all of the hurdles that are involved in getting that status. So you still have meaningful requirements on, showing that there's a real need for the service, the medicine, the treatment, whatever it is that you're trying to get approval on, and that there's a real basis to believe that the benefits of the service outweigh the potential harms. Because remember, without going through the full FDA approval process and all the testing that goes with that, you don't have the same high bar as far as evidence of safety and efficacy, but you need to set some real thresholds to protect the public. So we would expect all of these vaccines to be rolled out under an emergency use authorization. I should say all of the vaccines that are rolled out. We would expect them to be rolled out under this EUA prior to getting the full FDA approval, which, might sound alarming to some, but we already have COVID-19 diagnostic testing being administered all around the country under this emergency use authorization. And, as we talk about the coverage mandates in a few minutes, plans are actually required to cover those tests despite not having full FDA approval, just because the public interest in, getting full testing, it's so important. And that same interest in getting, wide use of the vaccines is going to be just as important, if not, maybe even more important. So the EUA, we haven't had reason to talk about it much until this year, but suddenly it's in the spotlight. It's a huge topic, and it'll continue to be as we see more vaccines being rolled out. I don't see any reason to believe that it's just going to be these three. We're going to have more.
And the biggest thing now everyone's talking about is the timing. When is this going to come out? When will we expect the first vaccines? I mentioned that the Pfizer candidate's the best one in terms of the government having stockpiled it and placed the biggest bet in terms of money on it. And so we're recording this podcast just before Thanksgiving, and the latest news I've seen on this says that in the second week of December, we could see Pfizer vaccine being distributed. The FDA is meeting on December 10th to discuss Pfizer's application for the emergency use authorization, and all signs indicate that they will approve it for that. But I mentioned before, it's important to remember here that the 95% effectiveness of this vaccine is internal data. That's why the FDA has to review it on their own, because there hasn't been actual official results in terms of the effectiveness of the vaccine. But if that happens in the second week of December, what's going to happen? How do we get this vaccine from the manufacturing lab out to the public and eventually into your arm? That's going to be just as much of a Herculean task as developing the vaccine was originally, right? I mean, we're talking about, in this country, 300 million plus people, a 2-dose vaccine, and getting it out to everyone. The goal of Operation Warp Speed was to do this by next spring. Now, we don't think that'll happen, but there is a hierarchy of who will get what first. And for everyone to know, I think it's important that this is being decided by CDC Advisory Committee, but ultimately by the states, because the military will be shipping this under armed guard, right, to certain locations around all 50 states and the U.S. territories. And then the states will be responsible for using their own infrastructure to get this stuff out to the places in need first. And we expect that'll be mostly first to nursing home residents, and then some combination of healthcare workers, individuals with high risk, and people who work at critical infrastructure sites. And then, going down from there to younger people after that, and finally with children. But we're looking at, again, a couple weeks from now to see this start to get rolled out. 40 million doses expected to be before the end of the year. That's enough for 20 million people. That's a good start. But again, there's huge challenges here. The Pfizer vaccine has to be kept at minus 70 degrees Celsius, which is colder than Antarctica. And not many places have freezers that can store the vaccine like that. So I think what you'll see is that the Pfizer vaccine will get distributed to sort of large population centers, maybe universities, large hospital systems, places that have the kind of infrastructure and equipment to deal with it, because there's some serious details about how it can be handled. The containers can only be opened twice in one day, and they've got to be closed within 1 minute. I mean, you don't want to spoil the vaccine. That'll be a huge waste if that were to happen. The Moderna vaccine is a lot more practical in terms of storage, only minus 20 degrees Celsius, which most freezers can handle. So I think you'll see that distributed probably to smaller locations that maybe don't have the industrial kind of freezer, the cold storage and dry ice that you need. So that's a good sign for the Moderna one. The combination, I think, of the two will be good. But yeah, I mean, this is going to be a huge task in terms of distribution. I think the plan is for the government to work with large corporations like CVS, which already have 10,000 pharmacies, right, to help administer the vaccine. And frankly, like Andrew mentioned before, we already have testing going on nationwide. And so a lot of the infrastructure that's put in place to deal with COVID testing, everything from pop-up trailers to these sort of standalone facilities, I think we'll utilize those to distribute the vaccine as well. But one final note here in terms of distribution of the vaccine and actual vaccination is there's a lot of evidence right now that people don't want to take this vaccine, which is kind of scary. So you have a study out of New Jersey finding that only 60% of doctors felt safe taking it. Only 40% of nurses felt safe taking it. So that could be really the wrinkle in this whole thing that derails this effort. If we can't convince the public that the vaccine is safe and worth taking, then this sort of prolongs the conditions that we're in now. We'll have to see how that plays out. But in terms of, coverage requirements, employer considerations, I want to mention at the start before I turn it to Andrew on this one that has been decided by the Supreme Court back in 1905, actually, that the federal government can force the public to get vaccinated. This happened with a smallpox outbreak in Massachusetts, actually, where the court ruled that it was in the public interest to require vaccination. So we know that the state can do this. But in terms of plans and what they must do and what not do, let's talk to Andrew about what the CARES Act actually requires from plans in terms of coverage.
Sure. So thus far, we've mostly been talking about the CARES Act and the FFCRA, which CARES Act expanded on in the context of testing, right? Because for most of the year so far, we've had no real reason to talk about coverage of vaccines, but now they're right around the corner, so it's relevant. The CARES Act requires your employer-sponsored and your individual plans basically to treat these vaccines as, preventive services, like any other preventive services under the ACA that have to be covered at 100% benefit level. So you have a combination of requirements imposed on payers as far as what they're required to cover, how much they're required to pay, and providers as far as, requirements like balance billing. So during the public health emergency, which we're still very much in, private health insurance plans and health plans will have to be required to cover all the costs of those COVID-19 vaccines, whether it's in network or out of network. So that there's no differentiation, just like your standard preventive services requirements. It's 100% benefit level in network or out of network. And as far as the actual dollar amounts, unfortunately, but not surprisingly, because we have several different vaccines, and even if we just had one, it's just sort of the nature of our system that we can't say exactly how much it's going to cost. But a Medicare price that's been floated out there is $45.33 for the 2 doses for one of the vaccines. So there's no federal rule that's in place yet. It might not come, it might come. But regulating the amount that can be charged for these vaccines, just like any other prescription drug in the market, the manufacturers tend to be free to charge whatever they want. But with the visibility and the need for, huge amounts of the population to take this vaccine, we'd be surprised if we saw price gouging here. And if we saw it from one manufacturer, it would be a bad look. And, by the time we see broad rollout, we're going to have real competition, not as far as, actual utilization. I think everyone who takes it is going to take what's available, but as far as keeping those prices reasonable. So we're talking about vaccines, preventive services. So we really shouldn't be looking at huge claims, stop loss issues, probably talking in the, tens of dollars rather than the hundreds or thousands of dollars. But, it remains to be seen.
A couple of points on the price issue there, Andrew. One is I was reading about how this advisory committee, which is going to approve or recommend the vaccine be used, typically it takes up to a year for a plan to be required to cover a vaccine after this committee meets, but it's been shortened to 15 days. That sort of shows you the urgency with which this needs to happen, and we want this, the vaccines to get rolled out. And then you mentioned the Medicare price. So for out-of-network providers, important note here that providers are not allowed to balance bill for the vaccine here. So if you do have employees who are receiving the vaccine sort of out of network, and you have language in your plan document supporting Medicare as a price benchmark to use, an index to use, then sort of that's going to be it for the provider in terms of what they can recover from the plan and the patient. There's no balance billing allowed. So that's important to note. And you're right that this is going to be tens of dollars, not hundreds of dollars. I think that the price the government paid for the Pfizer vaccine was $19.50 per dose. So we'll see how that translates to the private market. That's, again, the amount that the government's paying, probably lower than what private payers will pay. But we'll have to see. There could be rebates. There could be other things involved, price concessions, at least in the short term. We'll see if the vaccine prices jack up in 2022 once the rush sort of subsides, but we'll have to wait and see on that. But look, the final issue we want to talk about here that's probably as important as plan considerations is what about employer considerations? What about mandatory vaccination for employers? Will there be liability if you don't require your employee population to get vaccinated? Or will you have liability if you do require it and there's some kind of adverse consequence, some kind of reaction or side effect? What's your exposure there? So I think, why don't we talk first about the issue of mandatory vaccines and the question of, can an employer require the vaccine? Andrew?
Yeah, so this body of law isn't fully developed, but we have parallels that we can draw to. So the very general guidance is that an employer is able to require vaccinations as a condition of returning to work, as a condition of continued employment. But the two major caveats there are going to be, one, religious accommodations, and two, medical accommodations under the ADA. So we're crossing a little bit into employment issues here. So we would say, of course, consult with an employment attorney in your state. There could be state rules that impact this, certainly. But generally speaking, as long as you're making accommodations in those two important situations, an employer is going to be able to require vaccinations, as a condition to returning to the office or even as a condition to continued employment, which is separate from the coverage issue, of course.
Yeah, and look, this is, like Andrew mentioned, this is an undeveloped area of law in many ways because we haven't really had to see a vaccine issued on this scale in really over 100 years. But in terms of liability, there are some cases, and again, we would ask you to consult with attorneys that specialize in employment law to be sure on this, but if you have a workforce that's unionized, there are special considerations for you to look at. If you are working in a special industry, there's some talk about how OSHA itself might issue citations under the general duty clause of OSHA to employers who fail to offer vaccines in certain industries. So again, there are going to be some nuances that are important to consider depending on the makeup of your workforce. But in the question about whether you should require vaccination, it seems like the general consensus is if you can, you should. But note that in terms of liability, at the moment, there is no real protection for employers. If, for example, if you do set up sort of an on-site vaccination program and you're administering the vaccine at your workplace, that could expose you to liability, certainly through workers' compensation, if there's some kind of issue there, because there could be, unknown side effects or reactions that people may have. And it does look like that, those instances would be covered under workers' compensation. There's some talk in the Senate right now that, the Senate Majority Leader would like immunity for employers with respect to COVID-19 related incidents. That presumably would include any incidents that arise from the use of the vaccine, but that's not yet the case. We haven't seen another relief package really seriously considered, but we expect that when there is one, if there is one, this would be an important component of it, because at the end of the day, you don't, as an employer, want to be exposing yourself needlessly to liability, especially where, as we mentioned, there's going to be a real tremendous effort for immunization to happen all across the country, from everything that, from your local CVS to providers' offices itself. So the need for an employer to have an on-site sort of vaccination program might be limited or really non-existent, depending on how well we can get this vaccine distributed. So I would say the best answer for now on that is to hang tight and wait and see, wait a few more months until, the first round of people are vaccinated. That's really when, after that, we'll start seeing the vaccine become available to your more general employee population. But we're not there yet. For now, we have encouraging news. We have these 3 candidates. Like Andrew mentioned, there's going to be more than 3. There's, I think, at least 5. But we have 3 that are really, really effective based on initial data. We've got sort of a plan in place to distribute the vaccines. That's good news, and we can hopefully expect to turn the page, sort of turn the corner on this virus as we enter 2021 and talk about, the more pressing issues that face the industry and hope to deal with those. So for the FIA Group, on behalf of myself and Andrew Silverio and our producer, Pat the Man Santos, I want to thank everyone for tuning in to this episode of Empowering Plans, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.